What conspiracy theory do you genuinely believe in? The lost cosmonauts theory, that Yuri Gagarin wasn't necessarily the first person in space, just the first to successfully return to Earth alive. The Soviet Union supposedly covered up several failed space flights, with cosmonauts either being accidentally launched into deep space, rather than Earth orbit, or dying upon failed re-entry. It's complicated by the fact that the USSR did actually cover up several accidents in their space program. Astronomer here, there is a long-standing conspiracy theory of the lost cosmonauts, which basically says that many cosmonauts died in training and in spaceflight during the early days of the USSR space program. These are basically people who say Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space. He was just the first man to survive. Most of the alleged lost cosmonauts, to be clear, have no basis in reality, and have been debunked. But in the 1980s, the Soviet Union did finally acknowledge Valentin Bondarenko's death, before Yuri's famous flight, during cosmonaut training, during an accident in a low-pressure chamber 3 weeks before that space flight. Valentin had a spark in the high-oxygen environment, and suffered third-degree burns in the half hour it took for them to open the door, pretty similar to what the Apollo 1 astronauts died of a few years later, and died later in the hospital, for this noble sacrifice to manned spaceflight. What did the USSR do? Airbrushed him out of the official photos of the first group of cosmonauts, and did crude attempts to erase his existence for years afterwards. So there really was a lost cosmonaut, but he didn't die in space. My heart always goes out to Valentin Bondarenko, dying such a painful death, but instead of having his sacrifice honored, his nation tries its best to forget about him. Frown. A large number of protesters were shot and killed in the lead-up to the Mexican Olympics in 1968. The Mexican government was tired of widespread protesting, making them look bad, so they waited until a large protest was being staged outside a governmental building. The building was lined with cops and security. The official story: protesters attacked the cops, cops retaliated, chaos ensued. The real story: government hid CIA sharpshooters, I forget the Mexican equivalent of the CIA, in buildings nearby. When the protest was in full swing, the CIA opened fire on the cops. The cops, believing the protesters were attacking, then fired on the protesters. Many protesters were killed. Counts of deaths to this day are unknown, since the government had planned for this, and had crews ready. Once the protesters were scattered, the crews moved in and cleaned the entire scene up. No bodies left, no blood. To this day no one knows how many people were killed there. It worked out mostly for the government. The protest movement was largely squashed that day. This is known because a recent Mexican president, in the name of openness, opened up a bunch of old government files, so it's well documented. Operation Snow White was the Church of Scientology's internal name for a major criminal conspiracy during the 1970s, to purge unfavorable records about Scientology and its founder L. Ron Hubbard. This project included a series of infiltrations and thefts from 136 government agencies, foreign embassies and consulates, as well as private organizations critical of Scientology, carried out by church members, in more than 30 countries. It was the single largest infiltration of the United States government in history, with up to 5,000 covert agents. That the planet Venus was at one point a comet birthed from Jupiter. Its birth created the spot on Jupiter. It traveled outside our solar system, and back, passing Earth so close one time, that it created the Mariana Trench, and also the floods of biblical times. Source: Emanuel Velikovsky, Worlds in Collision. It also states that Earth, Mars and Saturn were once their own solar system, with Saturn as the star. When the two systems merged, there was basically a plasma war between the two stars, with our current sun winning. This is also part of the electric universe theory, that states that the stars are electric nodes, and electricity is the most prevalent force in the universe, not gravity. Dyatlov Pass incident. 9 ski hikers were found dead and half naked in the Ural Mountains. Some died from hypothermia, but others died from blunt force trauma, like a fractured skull and chest fractures. 2 bodies had burnt hands. Another body was found with their eyes and tongue removed. The area the bodies were found were closed to the public for 3 years. The night of their deaths, other hikers nearby remember seeing orange orbs in the sky. The investigation concluded the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force. Theories include Soviet military weapons tests, mass panic attack, due to infrasound, UFOs, or Yeti-type creature. Not so much a conspiracy theory as it is a mystery. An entire 99-ton locomotive appears to have just vanished in the 70s. The engine was the Central Indiana Railway No. 1, an electromotive division SW1, a 600 horsepower switcher that was the 44-mile line's only engine. Literally, no one knows what happened to it. Even stranger, there's basically no information on even the railroad itself online. The only thing with any useful information at all is the spring 2013 issue of Classic Trains magazine, where on page 88, it says it was last seen in Wheatfield, Indiana. Apparently, no one knows what happened to it, because there are no records of it being scrapped, put in storage, sold, or anything. The Titanic, Olympic conspiracy. It has credibility, because there is photographic evidence. It's really one of the only conspiracy theories that I'm willing to put much belief in. The sister ships, and their third counterpart, the Britannic, were owned by White Star Line. The Olympic was put into service in June 1911. She collided with another ship, the HMS Hawke, in September of 1911, and both ships were badly damaged. The accident was a financial disaster for White Star Line, as they were found to be liable for the accident, and had to pay for the damages to both ships and legal fees for court cases associated with the accident. Repairs on the Olympic took nearly 2 months, and parts intended for the Titanic, which was still being built during this time, had to be given to the Olympic instead. Only a few weeks after being returned to service, the Olympic suffered another minor incident, where one of the propellers broke off, and pieces intended for the Titanic were once again cannibalized. At this point, the Olympic was looking like more and more of a money drain for the White Star Line, though its achievement in not actually sinking, despite a major accident that should have sunk it, cemented the Olympic-class liner's reputation as unsinkable. But I'll get back to that in a moment. The Titanic was finally finished and ready to leave port on her maiden voyage on April 10, 1912, having been delayed while new parts were made and delivered to replace the ones needed for the Olympic, and from there, we all know the story. She went first to France, and then to Ireland, and then began her trek across the Atlantic to New York, during which she struck an iceberg, and after nearly 2 hours, sank, taking 1,500 souls with her to a cold, watery grave that would not be seen again by human eyes. For nearly 100 years, the Olympic went on to have a 24-year career as a successful ocean liner. She served during World War I, where she earned the nickname, Old Reliable, for her impenetrable hull. And then in 1919 she was re-outfitted to be a civilian passenger ship, and served as an ocean liner until 1935. When she was retired from the fleet, her ownership changed hands several times, and she was eventually dismantled and sold for scrap metal. But what if it wasn't the Titanic that sank? What if it was actually the Olympic? What if it was a ploy to remove a faulty ship that was costing them more money than she was bringing in for White Star Line, and cash in on her £1 million insurance policy? So here is the conspiracy theory. At some point, after the Titanic was completed, they switched the identities of the ships. The new Titanic was actually the Olympic, and the Olympic was actually the brand spanking new Titanic, fresh from the construction yard with zero problems and zero history. They intended for the Titanic to suffer some sort of failure that would result in the destruction of the problem ship, so they could collect the insurance money. I doubt they intended to also cause the deaths of 1,500 people. The events that transpired, which led to the sinking of the Titanic, possibly happened purely by chance, and the iceberg wasn't part of their plan, i.e., they didn't hire the captain to specifically ram the iceberg to sink the ship or anything like that. They probably had another plan involving the repairs that had already been made on the ship when it collided with the HMS Hawk. In any case, it wasn't really the Titanic that left port on April 10, 1912, it was the Olympic. After the sinking of the Titanic, White Star Line received a tidy sum of £1 million in insurance money, or £89,289,575 in today's money. This, of course, ruined the insurer, Lloyd's of London. There's an additional conspiracy theory that American financier and banker J.P. Morgan was in on this whole scheme. His company, J.P. Morgan & Co., financed the International Mercantile Marine Company in the hopes of becoming rich off of sea travel, but this turned out to be a bad investment. Because of the unpredictable nature of sea travel, and travelers themselves. J.P. Morgan, or one of his associates, may have schemed with White Star Line, who was a subsidiary of this IMMC, in order to bankrupt the IMMC and allow J.P. Morgan & Co. to withdraw from the IMMC without breaking a contract. I cannot provide evidence for this beyond speculation. The unsolved murder of Jill Dando. She was a British journalist who was murdered execution style. It's been said her killing was ordered by the BBC because she was going to expose the child sex rings within the BBC and UK political circles. I think her first expose was going to be on Jimmy Savile. They took care of her before she could expose the pedophile networks within the higher echelons of UK society. She most definitely was going to do this. My aunt is a journalist for a huge British paper, and ran in the same circles as Jill Dando. My aunt also covered the royal family for about 5 years, and the thing she told me about them that they weren't allowed to print would make you think twice about that parasite of a family. The Holocaust numbers were grossly inflated and reiterated in order to garner more money for Israel's repayment and support. While no, I think the Holocaust did happen, the sheer manpower, energy, and time it would take to gas and burn over 6 million people is ludicrously large, more than what Germany would have had available at the time. Houghton Mifflin and Macmillan, history book owners, are all primarily Israel-based companies. And with the Rothschild family having such a huge monetary stake in media, they can push essentially whatever they want. As such, the figure 6 million is ludicrously inflated. This makes government agencies and citizens feel bad, thus sending apology money and reparations to large Jewish sects, thus perpetuating the cycle. Not all of the 6 million Jews were gassed or burned. Many died due to starvation, infections, or being shot. The biggest issue here is that nobody is claiming 6 million people were burned or gassed. The gassing is a popular image because it was true extermination, a process by which the only purpose was to eliminate certain groups of people. But this wasn't the only way people were killed in the Holocaust. Many were shot in streets, worked to death in camps, and more. The government did a study on the effects of syphilis on African Americans who were infected and did not know it. These people were made to believe that they were receiving free health care, when in reality, they were being studied and not given treatment, despite penicillin being widely available at the time. Look up the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Probably too late to be seen. This is the craziest conspiracy I ever heard. In the 1990s, the Canadian government were using a homosexual detector, called the Fruit Machine, to find gay men and fire them from their jobs. Edit. The electronic device was only used in the 1960s. The systematic gay purge, also referred to as the Fruit Machine, continued into the early 1990s. The Fruit Machine was not only the systemic targeting of queers in the civil service, but also an actual contraption. It looked like a dentist chair, with cameras and sensor attached, along with a black box that displayed images. At eye level for the victim, participants would volunteer to have their stress levels checked, when the machine was really an attempt to tell if a person was queer. Images shown to the participant would include erotic photos of men and women, with other meaningless visuals. If she or he showed any sign of supposed arousal during a photo of someone of the same sex, they were added to the watch list. The Canadian government pulled the funding on the fruit machine in the 1960s, but that didn't stop the RCMP from constructing more invasive tests on unsuspecting participants. They continued with their stress tests, which began to include plethysmographs, highly suspect devices that attached to genitals to gauge arousal. Even after Trudeau decriminalized queer sex, the fruit machine kept secret tabs on Canadians in the civil service up until the 1990s. When Fody first started researching the film, she was shocked this had even happened, and how long it continued. It began in the 1950s and wasn't eliminated until, seriously, the early 1990s. But as her work continued, what surprised her most was how this went far beyond people losing their jobs. Crazy that the US distributed textbooks to children in the Middle East. Can't remember exactly what countries, that gave detailed instructions, complete with diagrams on how to kill, in the 80s and 90s. When the US was concerned about the Soviets, these books essentially fueled what became the Taliban. I learned this yesterday in the documentary The Muslims I Know. I thought that the US created the Taliban thing was a conspiracy, or a reference to the effect of our actions. But no, we actually created it. Operation Himmler, the false flag operation that preceded World War II in Europe. German soldiers were dressed in Polish uniforms, and made to stage attacks on German borders. I've always felt that, in light of this historical fact, and the fact that the American government admitted making similar plans of their own in the 60s, Operation Northwood, people have a responsibility to question acts of terrorism, and particularly those that lead to war, with the utmost scrutiny, and objectivity. Above all, I think this term conspiracy theorist holds far too much weight, when in fact it is a rather empty distinction. I mean, a detective in the course of his duties will entertain theories about the possibility of people conspiring, so by definition he becomes a conspiracy theorist. It's a useless term, and really only acts as a thought stopper, enabling some very real conspiracies to go largely unquestioned, because everyone switches their brains off and turns away the moment the term is used for fear of being seen as nuts. Why do people find it such a hard stretch to consider that people in power very often conspire to commit unlawful acts as a means to maintain and develop their positions of power? It's really one of the absolute constants in life, right up there with death and taxes. It's conspiracy theory, a useless term and really only acts as a thought stopper. That's precisely why the CIA promoted the use of that term. With that out of the way, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want more content to keep appearing in your subscription box. Thanks for watching, and until next time.